Jason,
Welcome to the National Indian Gaming Association's The New Normal, the Future of Class 2 Gaming. My name is Ashley Cope and I'm the marketing manager for the Indian Gaming Trade Show and Convention. I just wanted to share a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone is muted by default except for our speakers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question or chat box and they'll be brought up at the end. And this session will also be recorded and available on our website. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Victor Rocha, Conference Chairman of the National Indian Gaming Association.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Rocha. My co-host is Jason Giles, and this is The New Normal. Oh gosh, what is this thing doing? So today's conference, we're talking, in today's show, we're talking about Class 2. We're talking about the importance of Class 2. What's it, for us, hold on one second. In today's webcast, we're talking about the importance of Class 2 gaming in Indian country. While Class 2 has been described as Indian country's escape hatch for bad deals, many misconceptions still abound about the technology, gameplay, and legalities. Today, we're getting down to the brass tacks of Class 2, what it is, what it isn't, and why it's imperative not just to tribal gaming, but tribal sovereignty. Today's guests are very well versed in the subject of Class 2. Let's welcome our friends Witt, Director of Central Determinate Gaming at Incredible Technologies, Jeremy Tyra, President and CEO of Class 2 Gaming Solutions, Judith Shapiro of Shapiro Law Firm, and of course, Jason Giles, the Executive Director of the National Gaming Association, is my co-host. Welcome to The New Normal, everyone. How are you doing?
doing great. Thanks for having us, Victor.
Yeah, I apologize. Right, I had this teleprompter, and for some reason it was all working, but right when I started, it froze. So I was like, "Where's my script?" So I had to grab my script real quick and trying to be a little more professional and get things done. But you know, technology goes, right? So you guys, welcome. I mean, I'm seriously, you know, this is an issue that has been dear to my heart for a long time because you know, when I started in tribal gaming, you know, I came in through Pechanga.net as a news aggregator, but as a Pechanga tribal member, you know, when we started in '95, we opened up our casino with gray market machines, right, Russ? You remember these early days, and Jeremy, and I know Judith, I know you do. And you know, it was such an important component of what we were doing at that time. We weren't supposed to be gaming. We weren't supposed to be having these casinos, and yet we opened them up. And you know, in California, the state went after us, and then there was these court battles. In the beginning, Judith, you remember there was a Class 2 machines they were calling the Paula compact machines, which I believe Jerry Levine, who was our tribal attorney at the time, had to do. And it was a really big deal, the fact that we had these Class 2 machines. And in the beginning, they were a little bulky, a little awkward, but they were, you know, pretty amazing. And just like the gray market machines, you know, they were just an important component about what we were doing. And the reason why I say this is because without the revenue these games brought in, we would never have been able to afford the attorneys or the advice, the consultants, to pay for the initiatives, to pay for the progress that is tribal gaming. We would not be here without Class 2 and gaming. So that's why it's an issue that's important to me. Russ, try to change my mind.
No, I think you're right, Victor. And you know, some of the stuff that we were talking about before we went live here was, you know, the conversation we had at the trade show, right? We had two panels, you know, talking about Class 2, and our first panel, you know, we had Chief Connors from the Mohawk tribe, we had Jerry Allen, CEO of Seven Cedars, and we had Sharon Matheson from Chicken Ranch, California. You know, three very distinct regions of the country, but all of them saying the same thing. You know, how Class 2 and the performance of Class 2 has increased, and post-COVID, the reopenings, you know, the revenue for Class 2 has shot past Class 3. So three very distinct regions of the country, three very distinct ways that they were using Class 2, but all being very successful with it. And, you know, that was very interesting to hear their stories, you know, and probably the most interesting of the three, you know, talking with Chairman Matheson, Class 2 has done so well with them. Their new facility that, they've secured funding for is going to be all Class 2. That's it, out on the main highway. And, looking at somebody like Chairman Matheson and looking at what he's doing from a leadership standpoint, and that's probably the key thing. The places where you're seeing Class 2 do well traditionally, like in Oklahoma and these other markets where it's starting to emerge, it's coming from the strong tribal leadership down. So the tribal leadership is saying, we're making this commitment. We're doing this for any number of reasons that, that they are moving to Class 2, but it all starts with that understanding and basically that top-down leadership, decision to do that. And, that's what we talked about. And that's why we created like the Class 2 immersion workshops, for NIGA. It was for the tribal leaders to talk to other tribal leaders, share their stories, share information, and empower each other. Because to make that commitment, Jeremy, Judy, and I talk about this all the time, you have to make that commitment towards it. You have to go in, you have to be fully vested in it, because the technology is at a point where it's never been before. So all the things that Judy and others and some of the other attorneys that you mentioned, Victor, all that hard work, all that case law, all those decisions, the standards, finally have all of that work that's done. The technology has caught up to that. The technology, is you look at a Class 2, you look at a Class 3, they look the same, they perform. We're at a time in history now where you could finally take advantage of all that hard work that everybody put in. And the tribes that are doing that and the tribal leaders that are making those decisions, they're reaping those benefits.
I apologize. I had a couple. Tell us, that you made a lot of really interesting points, about making this commitment to Class 2. That sounds kind of scary. As Native Americans, we're kind of making a commitment to anything. It's kind of frightening without a lawyer. Judy, you happen to be an attorney. What a coinkydink. Sorry, people, I'm so bad I said that. I deserve to be flogged for saying that. Judy, welcome. How you doing, my friend? Russ brings up some really interesting points about Class 2 and the importance and relevancy of today. Why is Class 2 so important to try?
Well, I'm going to take you back a couple of decades since you sort of invited that. Back in '95, in California's in gray machines, and with all due respect, anything that was a compact game wasn't a Class 2 game. It was just a clunky Class 3 game. But during that time, 1995, so that's the year before the Seminole decision. At this point, Seminole has been opened in one way or another for a couple of decades. Well, maybe just about, 1.5 decades. But what they've got, and because I was writing opinions on this, they've got Class 2 games. And they're not today's Class 2 games, but they're games that they can operate and make money on. And make lots of money on without a compact, while they're at war with the state of Florida and pretty much everybody else. And we come out of that almost, but not quite, securing the right to have a compact. And some number of weeks later, the NIGC writes a letter saying, we notice you have a gaming facility and no compact. Yeah, no kidding, Sherlock, right? Of course there's no compact. We couldn't force that. So what does Seminole have for a period of some years after is the increasing technology of Class 2 games, because they can't force Florida at that point. And Seminole says, okay, fine, and becomes, I think, the first electronic standalone Class 2 game that I saw, not standalone, networked, if you pardon me, Class 2 game I saw, was shortly after the Seminole decision in a room of a NIGA show behind a gray, little curtain saying, hey, look at this. And I look at that, and it's the early, Mega Nanza game. And it is boring. And it is awful, but it is the reason we're here today. And it is the reason we're here today because the cases around all of that establish the principle that it's okay to have electronic card, electronic daubing, and a networked game. And once you have those principles, you have all the tools that we needed to go to war with the Justice Department and with the NIGC to say, you can't take that away from us. So those games, and there's a little PTS in Indian country because they saw those games and they said, yeah, those aren't going to work. And then there's a second wave of PTS because then all of the gaming companies who were sort of stepping their toes in were developing games that met a very constricted version that got through letters from the NIGC that said, well, you have to be playing against each other. So you have to have this many seconds, and you have to have this many jobs, and you have to have this many people. And the following things had to happen. And, you know, all those nasty lawyers kept on saying, nope, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that. And what you got was a machine that you could fall asleep in the 3 seconds before the game ended in modern terms. And so people say, we don't want those. Those are awful. But we used those, and that was our second line of weapons that backed down Phil Hogan, that backed down the bright line test, that backed down everything, that said, well, it can look like anything you want, so long as it's playing the game of bingo. You know, we collectively lost a game that said you could do pull tabs. I think that was legally incorrect, but we're stuck with it. But as a mathematical matter, and this is where everybody goes to sleep, you have enough probabilities from a bingo game, as long as the bingo game doesn't have to be 5 by 5 drawn in the following way and all of those things. You have lots and lots of opportunities by being creative about what the cards look like, by being creative about what the patterns look like, to build machines that can do possibly, and I'm told by Russ, more than what a classic class 3 game can do. Because you have the ability to network players across sites, because you have the ability to be creative in terms of what a game can look like. We have games now, because we won the war, this is our fruits of victory. We have games that, from the battles of the compacts in California in the 90s, in Florida in the 90s, and Oklahoma later on, we have the ability to use games that the states have no control over. That's key. Because if you're in Indian law, you're very familiar with the case that said states are frequently the most deadly enemies of the tribes. And if you have the ability never to be at war with a state again on the scope of gaming, that's a really good thing. So unless you happen to be in the very few states like Minnesota with a forever compact and no payment and no limits on games, it should be something that's of interest to you, because the next time you're facing the state, they're going to say, what have you done for us today? And we say, we don't have to. We just don't have to. And it's cheaper to be able to take an alternative game form than it is to fight a compact lawsuit that you can't bring anyhow, or to spend money on lawyers.
Yeah, you know, Judy, that's funny that you mentioned that, because you know, as someone who was around at that time, you know, and I think a lot of people forget how hostile the government was towards us as we were trying to stabilize Class 2 gaming. You know, we had, and Jason, I think you were, what time did you get out? When did you get out of the military? Were you in law school then?
Yeah, I mean, I missed all those battles. When I came to Indian Gaming Association, you know, it was right when Judy and all those guys, Ron, were doing the Class 2 working committee and battling with Phil Hogan. I mean, I came on right in the middle of all that. And I really, you know, I was not familiar with those late 90s cases, early 2000s over the whole Class 2 and what's bingo, what's not bingo. And it still is a little bit of an art form to be able to go back and remember all those things. And especially now with the way Class 2 is developing, where it's getting so fast that, you know, it's hard to tell between Class 2 and Class 3. And the other thing that's changed, and, you know, Judy, there's not as much contention between governors and tribes. You just look at what Florida's doing with the Seminoles down there in that compact. You know, it's almost like the Seminoles were in the governor's office, you know, hammering this out, and all these legal questions that are now, you know, being litigated. They just wanted to, you know, pull a DeSantis and roll right over all these, you know, legitimate legal questions. But guess what? You still got Class 2 down there, and it's still making good money. And same with around the country. You know, at our show, I don't know if anyone got around and saw some of the Class 2 stuff. You know, it's amazing right now. And even in the commercial industry, you've seen a resurgence in bingo, and people wanting to just go sit down and play the old fashioned bingo, for gosh sakes, because, you know, a lot of it is just simply, it's tactile, and you got to do something with your hands and everything. And it's not boring. Like Judy pointed out, some of those games were, you know, like if you might fall asleep in those 3 seconds. And so it is, I love that perspective, because unless you lived it, it really is hard to grasp how dire a situation it was around the country with regards to Indian gaming. And that's why Russ and everybody, and I'd like to hear what Jeremy has to say about it, to keep this class 2 viable and to keep it profitable and entertaining are the main things now. And I'm not so sure all this kumbaya with all the governors. Yeah, we're lucky we have a very favorable governor in New Mexico and Washington State, but they turn on a dime. They will turn on a dime. So you just got to be careful.
And that's a very important component of this conversation. It's really why we're having it, is because they will turn on a dime, and class 2 has to be an important component of tribal, not only tribal gaming, but tribal sovereignty. Jeremy, welcome. We apologize that we just shot off like rockets. Right?
No. These are all great things, Victor. This is it's a big topic, and as you all know, it's something I'm pretty passionate about. It kind of runs in my blood, if you will, kind of in the family bloodlines. And I was really lucky to get to go to work with my grandfather when I was really young, right out of school, and get to be around people like him and at MGAM, and people like John Yarbrough and Ron Harris and all these people you mentioned, these great attorneys, people like Jess Green and Judy and Liz Homer. And
wow, yeah,
just,
yeah.
So it kind of afforded me a perspective, a unique experience I'm really grateful for. I've gotten to learn a lot and see these people. And I think it, at its fundamental sense, it's about education right now, right? You've got to really kind of understand where we've come from to know where we're at. And then that kind of guides where we're going. And, I want to hop into the technology, but I think these points, Victor, you asked a great question, and that's why should tribes, trust it and do it? And I got to watch a lot of those early pioneers that saw the opportunity, right? There was this real blue ocean as far as gaming goes. And so these pioneers created these things alongside the tribes and their attorneys and the regulators and the operators, and they fought these battles. But what really came out of it all, and I want to kind of go to IGRA, but it's really just class 2 always has been, and it always will be, just a sovereign inherent right of the tribes, right? It is something that the tribes have and have utilized. It's been a great catalyst, right? We could probably draw lines to most compact negotiations over history, and class 2 gaming, at least the ability to harness class 2, was probably a huge catalyst to bringing state governments into the negotiating table, right? It was really the thing that kind of, IGRA talks about, right? Creating strong tribal governments, sovereign governments, right? That can promote self-sufficiency and economic development. And, I would venture to say class 2 gaming was one of the main catalysts, if you will, at a macro level that kind of launched that. And so if there's tribal governments and people, generations have changed, right? We talk about these things. I laugh because we talk about two-touch and the second delays and quorums and all these details, right, that are really important things to understand. But I think in a nutshell, you can just say, that was 20 years ago, right? Do you remember when your mobile phone had to be plugged into your cigarette lighter in the car, and it cost $18 to call for 30 seconds? Well, that's technology's come so far, right? Innovations come so far. And that's kind of where class 2 has been afforded that same thing. But where we are is, how are tribes going to utilize it, right? Our panel at NIGA, you were talking about that, and Russ hit on it, right? It is up to, I say what the future of class 2 is really up to each tribe, individually and then collectively. It's how do you need to utilize it, right? Back then, there was this big blue ocean. So it was kind of the field of dreams approach, right? If you build it, they will come. But that's not true anymore, right? The players at your tribal operation don't care if it's bingo, class 2, class 3. They expect good content, right? And so what it really is you've got these great companies out there, the technology's advanced, these regulations have stabilized through lots of hard work and fight over 20, 30 years from people. But the tribes have got to want it to be built, and they've got to use it. And the more tribes that individually and collectively get into this and learn about it and push, the stronger it'll become, because these smart companies will allocate all their smart people and all their research and development dollars, and it will continue just to build as an industry. But it won't if you don't have forums like this and you don't continue to educate. You know, I'll stop there, but those are, you know, those are kind of the major points that are exciting for me. Is you've got to keep educating in order to really harness the power of Class 2.
You know, you bring up some interesting points that I wanted to make too. Is and the first one, it's really about gameplay, you know, which is probably the most important thing. I mean, you can talk about sovereignty all day, and that's an abstract concept to a lot of people, and I even go as far as saying it is unknown to the modern gambler. All they really care about is gameplay. All they really care about is winning and going home with some money and being entertained and stuff like that. And, you know, initially when Class 2 and the gray market started, and as someone who's been around, I got to see it. And Judy, we were there. It was really fascinating because, you know, we were dealing with a hostile government that didn't want us to succeed. We were pushing Class 2 and saying, listen, and technology caught up to us, and we harnessed technology like, gosh, you know what I mean? Like nobody's business. I mean, we just really jumped on the technology bandwagon. And in the beginning, you know, we had a hostile government that said, okay, you can have it, but it has to be different than that. It has to, you're talking about, you know, the 3 seconds, or it felt like 3 minutes. You're talking about Dobbs, which was funny. You had those buttons and you had to hit it and touch the screen, rub your belly. And then, you know, it was just absolutely ridiculous. But then technology had caught up and moved, and pretty soon the only way you knew you were playing, and half the time you didn't know you were playing, is because you had the little icon on the bottom of the bingo balls or stuff like that. And now I can't even tell the difference on the floor. So my question is Class 2 a victim of its own success? You know what I mean? Is it become so successful? Has it become so much like Class 3? It's no differentiating any, and maybe it just feels better to play Class 3, even though there's no difference. So my question is, you know, is it a victim, and what is the issue with Class 2? Is it tribes are ignoring it? Is it they're not putting enough on the floor? Is that they forgot and they're moving on? Maybe everybody's thinking about mobile, you know? So anyone can jump in, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'll Russell and Judy will have a lot of good points on this. I think the answer is probably all of it, Victor. You know, they're all factors. It's something that we set out here to start this new business and study years ago. We just said, why isn't there more quality Class 2 games? Why isn't every tribe using Class 2, right? And that's a big topic, right? You know, that's where the National Indian Gaming Association, the Class 2 subcommittee do a good job putting these workshops on. You know, you got to really dive in, and there's a lot to unpack. But in a nutshell, it's really about the power of the design. Class 2, as a central determinant, server-based or network gaming, you know, system, has a lot of power. But that was not always harnessed in its design. Technology limited that in some of the early days. Certainly regulations and lawsuits limited. I remember at Multimedia Games, they would constantly have to be changing the way the bingo worked to stay ahead of the next lawsuit, not necessarily designing what the patron needed, right? What was the best experience for the player. And so a bunch of those things have just been, you know, steamrolled after 30 years of constantly beating at it by a lot of people and a lot of effort, right? And so what you have now is this really powerful thing. It is simply a fact now that any electronic game on the casino floor can be made Class 2, and its gameplay can be indistinguishable from the original design. So whether that's Wheel of Fortune or some new game that somebody in the garage creates, if they come up with the design, it can be played in a compliant Class 2 system, and it can play the same way. The really exciting part for me is that there's a real greenfield opportunity that's come out of, the regulations and the technology and the innovation, and that is greenfield game development. The one thing that a lot of people kind of skip over, I think, is in a compacted game, you typically have, you start with the display, and then the game designer can, after creating the display, can create the results from that. Well, bingo, by its definition in Class 2 gaming, is the opposite. You start with the results, right? Bingo determine the results. All the prizes are determined by bingo play. It's what the statutes say, it's what's required. And then you have the entertaining displays that are on top of that. And so as regulations have been stabilized, as technologies advanced, and as these companies spend all this R&D money and do all this innovation, what you've given is a really powerful tool in this particular genre of content, of game development. You kind of give a limitless possibility. The designer can do whatever they want experience-wise, results for the player, and then give them whatever they want in entertaining displays on top of that. And that, I think, at its core is what's driving the things that Russ is talking about and Judy's talking about. That's why you see examples of operators in Washington State have a percentage of their Class 2 outperforming its floor share, right? 20% of their floors Class 2 doing 35% of the revenue. It's in those cases, the games are simply better. They make more money because they're better for the players. And it's not just what we always think about. When I first started this, I thought, well, the most powerful thing about Class 2 is that in some jurisdictions with some compacts, you don't have to share revenue with the state. You don't even have to involve them in your regulation. That's sovereignty. That's a big, powerful thing, right? You don't have to share in this. Well, if those games were developed 20 years ago and they live in that design and they're just different than what players demand games be, well, then they're not as economically viable. So just saving some compact exclusivity fees is not enough. The real power to me of Class 2 really comes from IGRA. You guys talked about the Seminole Compact. I think it's a wonderful thing. It's one of the most beautifully written things I've read in all of my studies in gaming. And I wrote this down because on the panel Russ did at NIGA that you guys had, Victor, our dear friend who's promoted Class 2 for so long, Knut Knudsen, reminded us of something. This letter that the Department of Interior, published last Friday about the Seminole Compact, it hits on it as well. And that is, evolving technology should not be an impediment to the tribes participating in the gaming industry. Or as Knut said, if you remember when Congress passed IGRA, they specifically state in the intent of IGRA that tribes shall be, I want to get this right, permitted the maximum flexibility to utilize modern methods of conducting Class 2 gaming. Or even as NIGC regulations, the federal regulations for Class 2 say, there shall not be an interpretation to limit the use of technology in Class 2 gaming. To me, those are tremendously powerful. All regulations I've ever seen in gaming around the world very rigidly restrict what an operator or a regulator can and can't do. And in fact, Class 2 gaming, it says, no, tribes should be harnessing that. And so I think that's where the excitement is for me, is in this power. Every game can be Class 2. I don't think that's the goal. There's too many factors that determine why that should or shouldn't be. But every tribe should be utilizing Class 2. And you have to be doing that. You have to constantly be exercising that to get the best games, to get the investments, because you can't wait until you need it to get started. It's too late, right? This is a big evolved process, right? So
we talked about that earlier, that pretty much if you, whatever stage your Class 2 development is at, and it's driven exclusively by Indian country by definition. If you let it simmer and don't turn the heat up, it's not going to be viable because everything else is driven by a worldwide market to get better and better. So if you want class 2 to be good, if you want it to be your alternative to compact payments or to getting compact SCOSN or all of those things, it has to be a developing industry, and that only works if it's being used. And I say that it's outside of my legal determination, but these guys are banging that into my head.
You brought up something so very important that just happened. I know the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Brian, I'm drawing a blank, Jason.
Newland.
Brian Newland, yesterday when he was talking about the Florida Compact, he said that tribes shouldn't be denied the opportunities to participate in new forms of gaming because of technology. Now that just came out yesterday, and it's kind of what we're saying here with class 2, isn't it, Jeremy? So that was a really interesting take, and it's something that we have dealt with before. The fact that we're dealing with rules and we're dealing with technologies that's moving so fast, and that's one of the things that class 2 has afforded us, these opportunities to participate. And that was really, in the beginning of this, the fact that they didn't want us to participate. They kept throwing these roadblocks in and using technology, and that's what the Dobbs and 3 seconds and this thing, when you're playing class 2, and yet we're hearing this argument again from the Secretary of Interior saying this very fundamental issue that tribes should not be denied just because the technology changes. So we're being chained like a ball and chain to these rules and regulations while the rest of the country is moving along without us. So that's an interesting point, Jeremy, and I'm glad for you to bring it up. Russ, and what we're talking about too, when we're not talking about sovereignty, Russ, we're talking about gameplay, and we're talking about, you right now, you can't tell the difference on the floor between class 2 and class 3. So my question earlier was, is class 2 a victim of its own success?
I don't think it's a victim of its own success. I think its success is just starting to blossom. And it's, you look back, all of this is a process. Judy went back and talked about, taking us back a couple decades, all the work of Judy, Jess, and all the attorneys that pulled all that together. Then we got the regulations, right? Then class 2 moved out of the gray market, right? It moved out of the shadows. It became a gaming product that can be tested, that can get a lab letter, right? That can follow all these processes, right? It got into the mainstream. And then what happened, Jeremy? The investors and the other companies looked at it and said, wow, this is a viable technology. And then we saw this explosion of companies are merging and acquiring and joining together to the tune of, the number escapes me, but I believe it was $9.5 billion of mergers and acquisition money happened when all these companies, and VGT and Aristocrat and all these companies merged and acquired each other. And then what you saw, the after effect of that was this technological explosion of gameplay and watching everybody bring their class 2 content all onto the same platform and be able to deliver it across their latest and greatest hardware and technologies and things of that nature. Just 5-6 years ago, you would go to any of the booths at a major trade show and say, well, my class 3 stuff is here on this box, my class 2 stuff is over there on that box. Everything was different. Now you go in and you see everybody's latest hardware and you're like, I like that game. And the answer now is, oh, do you want that game in class 2, class 3, historical horse racing, Washington VLT, New York VLT, any platform that's out there, you can deliver content on that. And that's where you've seen this, ability where you can't really differentiate between 2 and 3. And, just to go on a couple of points that Jeremy touched on, and I could speak from our company. And when you talk about smart people, IT, I've worked for a number of companies in the industry. I've never worked with smarter people than this company and the way they think. When we came into class 2, having those conversations, and I saw Joe Valandra posted a question about mathematics. When we sat down with our head of math design, and he saw the small number of limitations that she's like, so I could make whatever I want. And we're like, yeah, as long as it follows these criteria. He's like, well, I can go and do all these things that I was never able to do in class 3 because I was confined. And they have taken it and run with it. And I'm sure that same type of conversation and those same type of situations are happening at other competitors, because when you take the reins off of somebody like that has that mindset, and Jeremy was right 100%, you build the concept of what you're trying to do from a gameplay standpoint, how you're going to incentivize and pay the patron. Then you build an entertaining display around it. Well, because we can do that in class 2, Victor, you alluded to it earlier, people want to have fun, they want to make money, but they want to be entertained. There is no platform that gives you the maximum flexibility to entertain a patron like class 2, because we're going to make the game, and we're going to make the most fun and complex game. And you can change the ride on it very easily. You can make any sort of level of volatility or anything you want for that game. And then you can make these amazing, images that are on that screen, because that screen's a blank canvas. In class 2, that doesn't mean anything. In class 3, it's the only thing that matters for the game. You are bound by those symbols and how they spin and what they do. In class 2, we just made a game, we displayed it at NIGA that doesn't have reels. And everybody came in our booth and was like, wow, like this is a little different. But we're trying to explore those fringes of what we can do, because we're not bound by that display. You can use that display as a blank canvas to make any sort of entertaining and fun, experience for the patron that you can, coupled with the most advanced math model in the industry. And that's a recipe for success at our company. Our company is now moving to a class 2 first development mindset. If it works in class 2, then we might bring it to class 3. That's a completely philosophical change in the industry, because we can make games more complex, more fun, more entertaining. But the other key thing is we get that data as soon as the game is out on the floor, because all that information is coming back to our server as well. Our games team, our marketing team, everybody can look at that and say, yes, that was, that changed good, that increased coin in, that increased, win per unit, that increased this. Oh, that change wasn't so great. Okay, let's pivot and go over here. We can move more strategically and not have these long delay cycles and have to wait 6-9 months for data to know if the game was good or not. We know instantaneously. We know in 30, 45, 60 days if that game is good. And then we can make games similar to that, or move kind of down that other path. That is really bringing true entertainment value, not only to the customer, but to the tribal operator. And you can't get that in class 3.
Go ahead,
Judy. Oh,
go ahead, Jason.
did you have some thoughts, Judy? Because
I do. And this is probably even also an antiquated idea, but some years ago, when you wanted to change a class 3 game, you came out with a cart and you took a box away and you brought in another box. And this whole central determination system, and what is essentially a blank canvas on that screen, means if the game isn't working, change it, fix it, replace it, do all of that. And it's a card. It's not a box. The flexibility that you have with central determination is one of complete freedom to say, this game sucks, I want a new one. And or fix the game because it's really not producing the way we expected it to. All of those things. And again, this may be antiquated because it may be that people aren't doing the fancy boxes anymore. But that's one of the many things that was really pioneered by class 2 technology and adapted elsewhere.
Judy, real quick, and then we'll jump over to Jeremy. This is a common question among class 2 vendors. There's a lot of tribes out there that are reluctant to adopt any class 2 machines on their floor. I'll just single out New Mexico as one, and even there they had the previous governor, they were in a real battle with her.
Yeah.
And the tribes wouldn't adopt class 2 gaming. And then one of the tribes went all the way and had their whole floor shut down. The IGT was threatened with, they couldn't license their games in New Mexico anymore. Mm-hmm. And they still wouldn't put in class 2 games. And I could only think, I suspected that there were class 3 commercial companies in there just showing the tribe or whoever that, look, you're never going to make as much money with class 2 but I don't know if that's true. I mean, it may always be true that you can make slightly more with class 3, but nowadays you want to talk about some of the advantages that, like you just said, come with the class 2.
Well, I mean, New Mexico, I don't know why they did that then, frankly. I thought it was a mistake. And some of us did a panel in New Mexico a couple of years ago to bring this kind of educational material about the state of the technology. And my understanding is that at least Sandia Pueblo has rolled out a major class 2 investment now. And if it works, there'll be more of it. And if it works, there'll be more of it at other pueblos. So that I think a lot of it is caught in the 20-year-old game technology.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
that's
it's education.
and it's something that, as I say, we studied it a lot. And I mean, this is a complex thing. Jason, it's a great question. And one of the things I found talking with particularly tribal government gaming operators over the years is maybe even more so than commercial operators that are public companies and living quarter to quarter by Wall Street. There is a tremendous demand on the people that run these operations because that money goes to fund the government, right? That is paying for roads and healthcare and education. It's not just an investor's profit or something that Wall Street gets. And so it's a very difficult thing for these people in these positions to take a risk. I used to hear the old, you can't get fired for buying IBM. And, there's been tremendous growth in this industry, obviously the last 20 years, lots of successes. And quite frankly, most of that's come out of class 3 compacted gaming. And so, when I say it's an education thing and it's what the future of class 2 is what tribes want it to be, it really just, it comes into that. And so it's a hard thing to do. It's not ever going to, in my opinion, just happen right away. Each tribe is different. Their circumstances change constantly. Their relationship with their state government is always in flux, right? Their needs change. And so to Russ's point, this almost has to come from the top down, right? The tribal government has to really understand the importance of class 2 and the investment in it, and almost give the operator the freedom to start to do it. I don't think every tribe, again, even though it is possible, it is just not in question anymore. Every electronic game on a tribal government gaming floor can play indistinguishable and make the same money, and in these greenfield cases more, than a compacted game. It's not even up for debate anymore. And so as that continues to be proven, success story after success story, that's what's going to knock it down.
Judy, sorry to cut you off. What are the ramifications of that, Judy? Governors aren't going to just sit there and allow the compacted games to be replaced and then tribes keep all the money.
Well, that's kind of nice. Governors have no say. They have no say. But
they won't take no for an answer. I mean, you know what they'll do. They'll get DOJ involved, everything else, the whole.
Maybe. I mean, maybe that ship has sailed. I'm guessing that what's his name is still there in the racketeering section, waiting to be brought out on the stage. But there's one of the big deals is that when we were fighting those fights back in the late 90s, the early 2000s, there were not mainstream companies producing class 2 games. IGT was one of the first of the big guys to step in, and it did so very gingerly. Now that there are mainstream big gambling companies stepping in, it's a bigger deal to start threatening to take licenses away and to threaten to do enforcement. And that was really something that we were looking at growing more, because it's one thing to enforce against people who are only vending class 2 games in Indian country, and another instead to go after scientific games and go after IGT and go after big market share companies. It's less likely to see the Justice Department threatening to shut everybody down, I think, in that context. I think that's one of the risk factors that has started to wane a long time ago.
And one of the things that you guys brought up, which I think is really interesting and very relevant to this, is when we were talking about New Mexico. Remember, they started not just threatening the tribe, but they started threatening the vendors and take away their license. And that's when everything changed in New Mexico. Those guys just cried uncle so quick, and that was a very big deal in New Mexico. So I think, you know, you're absolutely right, Jason. That was one of my thoughts too, is like, as tribes go more and start to rely on class 2. Now I know there's a class 2 casino in California with Lytton up in Northern California, and now with I believe Chicken Ranch, right? Is that what we're talking about, Russ?
Yep.
So Chicken Ranch going class 2. I think Judy maybe have a good point. Maybe that has sailed. I think that will, when you get maybe somebody like WinStar going class 2, then maybe you'll see a lot more pressure. But I think, you know, having these little ones like that, I think it's important for smaller tribes, especially a small tribe like Chicken Ranch, that can use every dollar, because tribal gaming is tribal government gaming. So I think there's a lot of really important issues that we're talking about here. But I think the main thing to remember is that, you know, whenever we get successful, someone's always going to try to tighten the screws on us too. So, you know, that one's, and then also, you know, I think another important issue here is the investment. It's not free, right? Jeremy, you do this out of charity, and Russ, you do this out of the kindness of your heart. But, you know, it's all this technology and evolving technology costs money. You know, one of the things I had a session once we did on on-premise mobile gaming. And I asked the vendor, you know, how much money are you guys spending on this and how much money are you making? And they're like, listen, you know, we're just doing this because the tribes want it and it's an investment, but that can only last so long, you know, because before that becomes very expensive. So Russ, what are we talking here? And Jeremy, I'd like you to get involved in here. Tell me, you know, the tribes need to buy into this or it's not going to be there, right?
Yeah, you know, we've talked about that for a long time. Jeremy touched on it. Judy touched on it. Panels I've done, you know, with James Starr, you know, coming from VGT, you know, it's like, we'll keep making the games. We'll keep investing in that R&D if the market is there, right? If the market shrinks, those R&D dollars are going to go to some other form of gaming where they're going to go make money, you know, online gaming, or it's going to be New York lottery. It's going to be historical horse racing. Those dollars and those engineering hours will pivot to something else. It's definitely, you know, as class 2 started, right? It was always a collaboration between the vendors and the tribes. That's even more important now, because as the tribes are finally getting product that really harness all the hard work that went into these previous cases and creating the class 2 technical standards and internal controls, it's probably now more apparent than ever that investment, right? That investment into bringing class 2 in to your facility and growing that and maintaining it is probably more apparent now than ever, because these games are complex. These components cost a lot of money. The infrastructure costs a lot of money. You know, speaking for my company, and I'm sure, you know, my competitors would agree, you know, we're committed to making those, you know, to making those investments if that market is there. If that market shrinks, right, or the revenue generation is not there and it doesn't look attractive enough to companies, you know, that market's going to quickly shrink and those resources are going to pivot somewhere else. So now it's more apparent than ever, because it just costs a lot more time and money and resources to create those games.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I mean, you know, Victor, we talked about why we started C2S, and that was just to give the tribes the ability to make any game they wanted class 2 and it would play indistinguishable, right? That's the fundamental goal. But one thing I got to see being involved with these different gaming companies, getting on the finance side and starting up class 2 companies, you know, making games is hard and it's expensive. It is creating content, right? It is an art form, and in any art form, whether you're a painter or a musician or a writer, to make something that a consumer will spend their discretionary dollar on and continue to do that is a difficult thing. And then to do it at scale, to be repetitive and do it iterative is very difficult. It was why I came to the realization, we're never going to make games here. We don't make games. We work with game companies, all these smart people. And, you guys are talking about mobile or mobile on premise or online, right? We've got the seminal potential of server on Indian land, patron outside, right? In the future. I don't know what that means, but I know in the online world, content is king, right? And so these companies like Russ's, and Russ mentioned people like James Starr and companies like AGS. We talked about Canute at IGT, and there's folks at every they only have so many resources, right? They've got brilliant people. They do great things, but they only have so much time and so much money. And so what is the total addressable market? And it boils down to a return on investment, right? That's what's going to dictate the future. Is if the tribes, I always say to every tribal operator I talk to, every time a salesman comes in and says, I got this new great game and it's a great idea, and you explore that and you go through that, why don't you ask them if you can get it in class 2? And if you can't, well, why? And do you want it, right? It's those people will go back and they'll talk to the executives, and there will be this snowball effect, I believe. But it really comes down to, are the tribes going to ask their providers, the content people, to continue to invest in this? And are they going to give them a marketplace to monetize it? Because at the end of the day, Victor, it is the content people are in the for-profit business, right? Us on a system side, or the bingo engine side, licensing IP and technology. We want to help the tribes do that, but we certainly want to monetize it as we invest in it, in this part as well. And so that's why these education things are so important. Because if you don't do it, people are never going to utilize what they don't know. And that's why these success stories are just critical, right? The more and more successes you have, the easier it becomes for different markets or different tribal operators to say, hey, maybe I need to be using this, or maybe our operations should be exploring it, because it's going to have an effect. It's not just today. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, these compacts expire. And as Jason mentioned, these relationships change. And if you let this class 2 go, you're not going to be able to bring it back, right? You've got to harness it and invest in it and continue for it to reach its full potential. So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, that was great, man. That was great, because it's a very serious issue, and it does feel that it's slipping through our fingers a little bit, that people are forgetting what brought us to the dance and what keeps us at the dance, and it's the technology, and part of this conversation is to remind people of the fight and where we've been and how we got here. Just because you don't see Indians named Dob anymore doesn't mean it wasn't important back in the day, but it was. I mean, you used to have to sit there and pound this button. You knew what a class 2 game was because somebody was pounding the button on the other side of that thing, but now it's still important. Gaming is not settled. Tribal gaming is not settled case law. As much as we think there is a Supreme Court that still wants to dismantle it, there are state courts that want to dismantle it. So we're still fighting to keep our sovereignty. We're still fighting. So that's why it's so important we don't let something like class 2 slip through our fingers. Now, that might have been a little hyperbole there. I might have got a little past it, but that wouldn't be the first time. Jason, what do we think, man? First of all, this is a fascinating conversation. As you can tell, I'm all worked up, man. So.
Well, we're gonna, hopefully we'll get to carry this on at G2E in October. Even at NCAI in Sacramento.
Oklahoma next week, man. Oklahoma.
Yeah, Oklahoma, of course. And I'll be there. Hopefully to see some of you guys there as well. I'll be at Oklahoma. But, class 2, I think the sky's the limit. We haven't even talked about class 2 opportunities in the sports gambling areas. I think there's big room for class 2 in sports gambling. So, someone will get creative. People love playing those number games on Monday Night Football, with the last 2 digits and all that. That's right up class 2's alley, all that stuff. So we might see forms of that coming out eventually around sports. So the sky's the limit. We're going to keep talking about it all the way up to our mid-year at Pechanga in November, and hopefully have a couple panels at G2E on it. God permitting, COVID doesn't cancel any of this stuff out. I think we'll be okay. But that's where our focus is. And as Jeremy just pointed out, our goal is to retain this in the long term, because the political fortunes and political whims change on a dime, especially within a state.
Can I jump in on one thing? You asked, oh, come on.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
You asked for us if Class 2 is a victim of its success. And I think that from what I hear, Class 2 could be so much more successful than Class 3 because of the ability to expand creative opportunities. Back 15 years ago, when I would be looking at a game, my mantra was, well, you can't do that. Can you fix that? You can't do that. Can you fix that? And you ended up with those stupid games. Now that's not what it is. Now I look at a game and said, oh, that's neat. How did you do that? And yeah, that works. And that's a big, big difference in terms of where these games can go. We are out from under those constrictions. And thank God I'm not trying to design games anymore.
Right. And that's what people forget, let's go back to the Paula compact machine, Judy. You remember those with Scott Crowell and Jerry Levine and Howard Dickstein and all these names from out of the past. Supposedly the creation story, they were in a hotel room in Sacramento, and they slapped it together, and that next thing we were supposed to be marching to that machine. And then the tribe said no and put initiative in California gaming. So one of the largest markets in the world. But Jason, I think you bring in a very important point, which is we did not even scratch the surface of this issue, especially talking about what it can be. We talked about what it was and what it is, but we didn't talk about what it can be. And I think that's another show. And if it's anything like this, I think we could talk about that for another hour or two, because we just tore this time up, guys. That was just too fascinating a conversation. I only looked at my watch once, and that was when Russ was talking. So, just kidding, just kidding. Just kidding. And that was at the beginning, Russ. So, that's how bad that was. You guys were absolutely brilliant. I think we had one question from Joe, and Joe was talking about the floor and making money and stuff like that. But I think, and I think one of the important things is going into Oklahoma, talk to the guys, talked about Class 2. Russ, how can people reach you? How can they get in touch with you?
We'll have our booth at OIGA. Come down, like Jason said, come see all the Class 2 stuff that'll be there. All the latest and greatest Class 2 products that you're going to want to see are going to be at that show. Come by the booth, come see what we're doing. Be excited to talk to everybody.
And I'm so glad that you didn't leave the steam room and you decided to do the webcast. We really appreciate that. Jeremy, how can people reach you, my friend?
Thanks. You could go to c2sgaming.com, and our information is there. You can message me on LinkedIn. Send me an email. We spend a lot of time, talking to tribes, talking to development companies, talking to international companies that want to figure out how to get their content to tribal floors. And, we're happy to share all that information, all the case studies we've done, white papers we've written. It really is a thing that I've said a couple of times here on this panel, but without the National Indian Gaming Association and the Class 2 subcommittee and people like you, Victor, that provide these forums to do this education, it is a very difficult thing to do. There's a lot of demands on tribal government time and leadership and the people that run these operations. And so without these places to really disseminate this and continue to share the success stories and where we're at, I think, we're at risk of not really capitalize on it. So thanks for that.
Thank you. And Judy, my friend, we can see you on Instagram and Facebook, and being the influencer that you are, we really appreciate your knowledge. And listen, you really provided some really solid information to remind people where we've been. So my friend, I'm very glad to call you a friend, and thank you again. And Russ, I want to get back to you too. Also, one of the things that we were going to do at NIGA, we didn't get an opportunity, and I'd like to do at G2E, is when we do this Class 2 and we talk about technology, when we're done, we'd like to give you guys a little tour on what the technology is, and so that it isn't just about Class 2 and it isn't this abstract concept. We want to take you and show you what gameplay and show you what the technology is doing. So Russ, I told you, my promise, we'll do that again in Las Vegas. So we'll make sure. And Jeremy, I'd like you to be a part of that, and also you too, Judy. So again, I want to thank everyone. Jason, this was a great show. It blew by very, very fast. So everyone, thanks very much. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you guys next week. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you very
Thank you.
Thanks.